Ladies and gentlemen, in this RedGamingTech.com video, we're going to be further analysing the recent rumours of the Xbox 720 being revealed on the 21st of May, so of course that will be next month. In case you guys haven't heard the news piece that Amata put out, I'll quickly go over it and then we could do some analysis on it, okay? Sounds great. So this is stemmed from a US reporter. His name would be Paul Thurrott, hopefully I've pronounced that correctly, and he's had a long-standing history of reporting rumours and events from Microsoft before they've happened, and usually they have proved to be true. Not always, of course, but quite often. And anyway, he is saying that the device, the Xbox 720, also known of course as Durango, will be released in November of this year, and it will be using Blu-ray discs. It will also be using Windows 8, and it will be quite expensive. Right now he's saying it will be between $300, that's with a subscription, or $500 without a subscription. Apparently the conference was originally to be scheduled this month. He also further comments on the long-standing rumours that the fact that an internet connection will be required, and his exact quote will be, going back and looking at some of the stuff I got a long time ago, it actually says, must be connected to use. That's in the notes, that's all I have, but it does say that. Interestingly enough, there is also a new Xbox 360 model. It will be codenamed currently as Stingray, and it will be very cheap. It's about £65 or $99. So there is rumours and possible speculation that this will mean that the new Xbox, so the Xbox 720, will not be backwardly compatible. So in other words, it will not play Xbox 360 games. Okay, so now we've caught up. If you happen to have not known that stuff before, if you had, then sorry for making you listen to it yet again. But now we're all on the same page. Let's do some analysis, let's do some speculation, and all the other good stuff that you guys really enjoy. So I'm going to sidestep the major one right now, which will be the pricing. And I say the major one because you guys know that the PS4 is apparently going to be retailing at $400, which in other words means it's cheaper. So we'll talk about that later. But what we're going to do straight away is jump onto Windows 8 side of things. And to say that this is interesting is, well, an understatement in my opinion. Now, the Xbox 360 was actually fairly easy to program for a couple of reasons. One of them being the unified memory. The second is it was using a shader architecture which was unified. The CPU wasn't too difficult at all to get around. It was just really the lack of memory, and it was only using DirectX 9. I believe it's a derivative of DirectX 9C, but I'm not 100% on that. I do know it's DirectX 9. And for that reason alone, quite a lot of titles, of course, are DX9 that happen to be on PC that are console ports, although some have been upgraded, if you will, to the shiny loveliness of DX10 or 11. But anyway, there are good things about the fact that this will be Windows 8. I'm going to read just a very small snippet of the interview, or the rumours, shall I say, his direct quote. Because it's a Windows 8 device, it's going to have the same, or basically the same, developer tools and developer APIs and that kind of stuff. He really likes the word stuff, apparently. So it's very important to realise that one of the primary reasons right now that Sony are getting a lot of love from developers is because the system is going to be very easy to program for. There are two layers of programming in effect, and I'm not going to go too much into the Sony side of things. If you guys want to watch those videos, they are available on the channel, and I suggest you go watch them if you've not already. But for the sake of this, there are two levels of complexity that developers can get into on the PS4. One is a very low level, one is the more higher level. Or to put it another way, one would be the kind of a lot of the stuff is done for them, and then they could just tailor it to their needs, if you will. And another one is they can basically rewrite things as they completely require. So in other words, start from scratch. It's really up to them, and that's very good for the system. Now, in this respect, Microsoft have also done very good as well, because if it is using a lot of the developer tools and APIs and various other bits and pieces, that means that if a developer has ever programmed for a Microsoft system before, in other words, say EA or what have you, they'll know pretty much exactly how to start using this system to a decent degree. In other words, they will be able to hit the ground running, and that's very important for a next generation of systems. There are a couple of reasons for that. One, in say 2 or 3 years time, they're going to constantly be able to improve their programming techniques, but more to the point, at the start, it means that the games are going to be less buggy. And this is also going to be fantastic, by the way, if you happen to be a PC gamer like myself, although as I've said millions of times now, I do like console games as well. One of the benefits is that, in theory at least, we're going to get better ports, and I emphasize the word theory, because nothing of course is set in stone yet. Furthermore, we do know that the Xbox 720 has a significant amount of RAM, at least from the leaked specifications, that has been allocated to OS functionality, and that definitely will be the case if Windows 8 is the base. In other words, if there is going to be a Metro-style UI or a UI of some description, it stands to reason that there is going to be a significant amount of resources that are allocated for that UI to function, especially in-game. Allow me to give you a very brief example. One of the reasons that, for example, on the PS3, that you were not able to browse the internet while you were, say, playing a game of Uncharted was very simple. To launch that internet browser, a certain amount of memory would have to be allocated to that browser to function. Fairly simple, right? Unfortunately, the amount of memory required would then take away memory that was already allocated to it in-game, and the OS itself had memory allocated to it. I don't remember the exact numbers if I'm completely honest. I think it was around maybe 30 megabytes for OS functionality, but when you start launching Chrome or whatever other browsers that system happens to support, you'll notice that some of the web browsers can actually take quite a bit of memory, especially if you've got a page that has a lot of code on it, a lot of images, that type of thing, or for example YouTube. A lot of data can be really used, and therefore, quite simply put, that 30 megabytes or whatever it was allocated on that system, it just wouldn't be enough to run the browser at the same time concurrently as the game. So in other words, it would take memory away from the game, and the game would either crash or just wouldn't function. So because of that, obviously it never came to fruition. So the idea here is that you're going to get a lot more of a seamless experience. Now, to Microsoft's credit, the Blade system and the general UI, if you will, of Xbox 720, especially when it comes to actually in-game, where you can invite the friends and friends list, achievements, that type of thing. Especially at the start, it wasn't so much later on, as obviously Sony made a series of big updates which have somewhat closed the gap, but honestly speaking, I think that Microsoft's system was still slightly ahead in terms of UI. Obviously, right now it's really up in the air of which system in terms of PS4, Xbox 720 is going to be better UI, but obviously if it is integrating certain features of Windows 8, or maybe even the basic UI as a standard, that would be very good indeed. It will mean that a lot easier navigation, and we are pretty certain that a variation of Kinect is going to be usable from previous rumours to actually navigate this UI. So, in other words, you should in theory be able to just use hand gestures or whatever to navigate really quickly. So it's almost like an extension of, say, touch, which if you think about it in a very logical perspective, is a very... It's a natural progression from touch to just simple gestures. Whether people like, say, hardcore gamers are going to enjoy it and embrace it, that remains to be seen. It really depends on how much faster it is. For example, to someone who doesn't know UI and so forth, it could be just a simple case of just, you know, flicking your hand a few times, you know, is a lot easier. However, it may not be faster. You know, kind of how when you're showing someone an application on PC who doesn't know anything, that, you know, you tell them click file, click save, then, you know, you type. Well, in reality, if you know how to save a Word document, you're just going to smash the Control S key. It's that simple. Or if you're trying to save something on, I don't know, Photoshop, you might press Ctrl-Alt-Shift-S to save it for web. On the other hand, if you don't know it, you're going to go all the way through it. So it might be a case of, if you know what you're doing, the control pad may still be faster. Of course, this is just pure speculation on my part. Now, I'm sure many of you know the specifications off by heart by now, from Xbox 720 rumoured specifications and the PS4's somewhat confirmed specifications. Obviously, certain aspects of the PS4 spec are still up in the air. We're not 100% sure what CPU speed it runs at, although we're pretty sure it runs at 1.6. We do know the type of CPU, we know the amount of GCN cores, we know the rough amount of power that those cores will bring. We know the type of RAM, we also know the bandwidth, and we know the Blu-ray, we know the speed of the Blu-ray discs, drive, shall I say, and we also know a few other bits and bobs other than stuff like how it, the console looks. We don't really know what the controller looks like yet, but we do know that the princely sum they will be charging for this is $400. And as I mentioned earlier, it seems that Microsoft are going in with 2 price points, $500 or $300 with a subscription. Now, there are a couple of options here. First of all, let's talk about these price points. It seems that Microsoft are not having a subscription model, or shall I say 2 levels. For example, you guys remember the Xbox 360 when it was first launched, there were 2 models. There was, of course, the arcade version, which came with no hard drive, no headset, I don't believe, and a few other kind of emissions, and that in the UK was £209. I'll just use British prices because I actually know them. And the premium was $279, I believe. It was either $279 or $289, I believe it was $279. And with that, you actually got the 20GB hard drive and the headset. Although many places were also bundling in games for a small amount extra, which is the deal I went for, by the way. But anyway, I digress yet again. So it doesn't seem that they're going to be going this particular route, and in my opinion that could be a very good thing, and I'll tell you why. It's quite simply put that when you start doing that, you start segmenting the users, and it's not so much of a big deal if you were to, say, put in a large enough hard drive anyway. But quite often when you're saying, hey, you know what, we're going to actually not make the hard drive as a standard, or we're not going to do this as a standard, you start to really trash the console in long term. And obviously that has meant that some developers may want to make it so the hard drive was mandatory, but they couldn't, and therefore they had to make the game suffer. In other words, the game performed worse because of that. On the other hand, with the fact that if they release the system at a very standard kind of pacing, it gives them a lot more options. That isn't to say they won't have a couple of price points. I wouldn't be surprised if, for example, they have a 500GB model and, say, a 1TB model. I wouldn't be surprised with that. But honestly speaking, if you were to open up your web browser at some point or another, and you were to go to something like Amazon or whatever website you use for PC parts, and you were to take a look at the prices between, say, 500 and 1TB, even up to 2TB, there's not that much difference in price. Okay, there is a small amount, but now even 3TB hard drives are not, prohibitively expensive. They're not going to break the bank, certainly when you buy it. On the other hand, you also have to remember that if you're, selling that in bulk, so in other words, not just, 1 or 2 of them, we're talking, millions of them, then obviously that cost starts to mount up rapidly, especially when you also combine that with very other expensive parts. So before we actually go into the price point in its fullest, you have to understand there's usually 2 models that console manufacturers go for when they're actually releasing and producing hardware. There's the model that Microsoft went for with the original Xbox, less so with the 360, but certainly for the original Xbox, and that was that the Xbox One was absolutely a behemoth. And I just don't mean for the size, I'm also talking about the raw power behind the system. I'm actually being very serious here. The system was absolutely a monster, and even PCs at the time, I remember seeing the system as a PC owner, and I thought to myself, wow, this is actually pretty bloody impressive. Okay, it wasn't PC beating specifications, but it was equivalent of something like the PS4 now, maybe even slightly more impressive in some ways. It had a rather ridiculous 64 megabytes of RAM, which back then was pretty high, but the CPU and the GPU were really decent in it, and that actually meant that the games on the Xbox One could actually be run at 720p in some cases, and the CPU is actually pretty nice. Okay, maybe not quite as impressive, maybe about as impressive as the PS4 specifications, but it was very impressive indeed. Especially when you consider that back then most systems, or most gamers, weren't playing in HD anyway. So 64 megabytes of RAM was pretty good. However, it was using a derivative of a Celeron slash, I believe Pentium 3 based processor. It was kind of a copper mine type of processor. That I believe that was running 733 megahertz, as I mentioned previously, 64 megabytes of RAM, and a GeForce 3, I believe, based GPU. And I haven't wikid that, so there might be one or two specs wrong there, but it was certainly very impressive for the time. My point being that it actually cost them money. In other words, when you bought a system, when you purchased a system, they were actually selling them for a loss, and by no means are Microsoft the first to do this. Microsoft have, of course, been one of the later ones to do that, so, but there have been other examples as well. So in other words, you sell the system at a loss, and there are a couple of reasons you may do that. One, you just want people to buy the system in hopes that you will make money back at the games. Microsoft did do that. They also, they figured, hey, when people start buying Halo from us, and people start buying games from Electronic Arts and Capcom and all these others, will get money from the fact that they have to publish our games on our system, and they obviously give us money for allowing them to publish games on our system. There's that mentality, plus the other benefit to that is that you, as a platform holder, or Microsoft in this case, got their name out there, and they got a lot of stuff right. They basically went from being completely unknown to almost a Sony level of success with the Xbox 360. They used the Xbox One as a guinea pig almost. And many people even said it at the time. Many people actually were joking that it's just Bill Gates, funding it out of his own pocket for a laugh, just for a bit of entertainment, just to see what it takes to crack the industry. And although, of course, they weren't being exactly accurate, you kind of get the gist. In other words, they just wanted to see, what does it take to make a successful online console? What do we need to do to make a good sense of community? And indeed, for example, even Xbox Live did not launch at the start of the console's life. It came later. So Microsoft used a lot of this to do a lot of market research in effect, and also get their name out there, because once you get the name out there, inevitably people are going to want to see more, especially if the successor is even more impressive than the original. So obviously in that respect, Microsoft could be going that route. In other words, or should I say, there's the other route as well, which is you sell your hardware at a loss. Sorry, at a gain. So rather than selling the system at a loss, like say the Xbox One, they sell it at a profit, which Nintendo did for, say, the Wii, the original Wii. They sold it at a pretty decent profit, because effectively it was just a GameCube overclocked. And so the manufacturing processes of the GameCube, the fact that RAM in it was basically negligible, the fact it was still on DVD discs and all the other bits and pieces, it was basically costing them very little. In fact, they were actually, in my opinion, it's one of the things I didn't like about the Wii, and it did kind of annoy me. They were actually making quite a bit off the hardware itself, including the controllers. Which, although it didn't affect me directly, if, for example, you needed to buy, say, 3 or 4 other controllers, most of my friends actually owned a Wii, so I didn't need to worry about actually buying separate ones if they happened to come around. But if that hadn't been the case, and I had bought, say, I don't know, Mario Party game or what have you, and they all wanted to come around, it would have cost me quite a bit, especially when you start taking into account the nunchuck or even the classic controllers as well. But nevertheless, in Nintendo's defense, they did do a pretty smart thing. They made quite a bit of money from the actual hardware, which was good, because their actual terms of software sold per console was lower. So Microsoft could be going with the theory that they don't want to sell the hardware at a loss. In other words, we're going to price it at either cost, or at a markup, in other words, where we're going to be making money for each of the systems sold. Now, as I was saying previously, there are two particular models. One is 500 and one is 300. These are dollars, and the 300 is with a subscription. Now, what exactly a subscription is, what you are subscribing to, has not been clarified as far as I'm aware. I have done some Googling, and I cannot find it as yet. No doubt it will be revealed 2 minutes after I post the video. But right now, there has been no mention of what it is. It's possible, given the fact that we already know about the always-on DRM, and the fact that we know the system is requiring internet to function. Logically, he says, putting on his Vulcan hat, logic would dictate that it will be online services that you are subscribing to. I don't think that's very difficult to figure out, but what? One of them would be something like movies and so on. Perhaps they've done a deal with something like Netflix or Love Film or whomever, obviously depending upon the region, country, or what have you. So there's that. There's always that possibility. You know, you will get a certain amount of movies, TV shows, whatever delivered to your system. I also would not be surprised if it came down to things such as games. PlayStation Plus has been very popular, of course, with PlayStation owners. For good reason, it's such a really good service. And the simple fact is, you pay a certain amount of cash, depending upon obviously the period of time that you wish to go for, and if you can get it cheap on, you know, off eBay or whatever for, say, a code to give yourself PlayStation Plus, and you get to download certain games for free. For example, Infamous or Infamous 2 or so forth. And it's a really good idea. It's a really good idea from Sony, actually. And I wouldn't be surprised if Microsoft do a similar thing. Not necessarily saying that they will give away full games, but it's possible they will. It's possible they will also do massive discounts, or at least reasonable discounts, on the new titles. So, for example, if a game comes from them, say Halo, 7 or whatever is going to be released, and you were to buy it, it would be cheaper. It also stands to reason that certain things such as beta access for subscribers, and various other bits and pieces will probably also be functioning, as well as possibly extra online. This is a natural extension, of course, to Xbox Gold, Xbox Live Gold. I would be curious if there is no gold. In other words, there is no just a gold service. My personal gut feeling is there probably will just be a simple way to play online. It will either be free, a la PlayStation, or you will have to pay a very basic nominal fee to do so. I'm actually good with either, as long as there's a purpose for the fee. And by a purpose for, I don't just mean the fact that you could play online. Okay, so I can do the same thing on the PlayStation. So in other words, it has to be as good, if not better, preferably better than the PlayStation offering. Especially as they're charging more for the system anyway. Honestly speaking, I wouldn't be particularly upset, as I've said, if they do charge. I just want the system to offer a very tangible, realistic service. 500, however, for a new console is very high for a new system. If the PS4 is cheaper, what worries me here is that the PS4 is going to have better specifications. I mentioned previously, many times over, that the PS4, at least on paper, for the rumoured specifications, is a better machine than the Xbox, and there's a couple of reasons for that. One, GPU power is definitely higher, has more GCN cores. They apparently are going to be using exactly the same brand of GPU, it's just one has more cores. PS4's seems to have 18, which is definitely, I believe, 6 more than the Xbox 720. So it's definitely a step up. There's also the other sticky situation of DDR5 versus DDR3, which is obviously a massive memory bandwidth difference. You can argue that the actual basic CPU, in other words, the actual general CPU, despite the fact it's 8 cores and all of that, it doesn't really matter in my opinion. It cannot use that amount of memory bandwidth. It's the if you were to look at, say, the Ivy Bridge on PC, which is considerably, if you were to look at i7, for example, on the PC, that's substantially more powerful than the PS4 CPU. That's a fact. But it doesn't have as much memory bandwidth. It's actually around a third more, I believe, than the PS4's allocated memory bandwidth, because the massive amount of memory bandwidth that's been touted for the PS4 is apparently limited when it comes to certain components. The CPU is apparently only getting around 20 gigabytes per second. That's according to developers. So, to be honest with you, DDR3 is going to be more than sufficient for the foreseeable future. Even on PCs, which, as I've mentioned before, the CPUs are definitely faster. So we're still on DDR3. Even the next generation, which is, of course, is going to be replaced Ivy Bridge, is going to be Haswell. That's going to be DDR3. You're probably looking at 2015 before we start hitting DDR4 even. And no doubt we're going to be looking at ridiculously fast CPUs with quite a few cores to really start saturating the bandwidth required. So one of the reasons the PS4's bandwidth is there isn't for any other reason. It's simply for the compute units, the GCN units. So it seems right now that the Xbox 720 is going to be using the small frame buffer, the small buffer that's in there, to really hit home, to really get the most out of the performance. So that kind of worries me. However, given the high price point, it's also possible that a lot of these specifications are wrong, and Microsoft have actually made an absolutely beastly system that's even possibly going to be able to compete with something like, oh, I don't know, the Steam box. And before you ask, we don't know exactly the specifications of the Steam box, which of course is going to be made by Valve. However, unofficially, it does look to be fairly powerful actually. However, it's also going to be pretty damn expensive itself, a lot more than 500. Furthermore, it's also possible that the price, the 500 or what have you, is going to be a simple reason of the various technologies within the system. For example, the Kinect controllers and everything else could well add up to the pricing, and maybe they won't have gold because of that. In other words, if you just pay that, it's a one-off fee. That's also a nice possibility. I certainly wouldn't be upset about it. We'll have to see on that one, I'm afraid. It's definitely a strange price point if it is true, and I really want to see why it's so expensive. I think that people generally are going to be on, well, most people I know anyway, when it comes to consoles, they're on one of two sides of the fence. They're either on the side of, wow, new technology, I must own it now, which, I'll be honest, I generally am on. If I've got the spare cash, I will buy the console on launch. I did with the Xbox 360, for example. On the other hand, there's also the other side of the fence where you think, I don't know, there's not that many new games on it that I really want. I don't know, I think I'd leave it for now, kind of side of the fence. And especially when you have a new system that's launching pretty much at the same time as another new system, in other words, in the case of Xbox 720 and PS4, they're both launching what I'm going to call at the same time period. Okay, even if you have December, let's say mid-December for the PS4, so 1 month. Let's even say 6 weeks. So the Xbox 720 launches the 1st of November, and let's say the PS4 launches the 15th of December. Let's say it is 6 weeks. I'm going to effectively call that the same time period. Most people only buy one, and there's a couple of reasons for that. One, it's Christmas and people's, finances are in a certain state. The other reason is that, honestly speaking, even if I have the capital, I might buy two. I might buy both for the channel, for the simple purposes of covering them for the channel. But if I weren't a channel owner, if I wasn't running RGT and it was just me on my own, or with friends or whatever, I probably wouldn't buy both, for the simple reason I would just make an informed decision. I'd say this one has better games on it, I'm just going to buy that, and I'm going to see how the other one does. Why? Because I know I can't play both, and and I'll just go from there. Really, I wouldn't really want to buy both. I don't really see it's a point. I've done it once before where I bought pretty much 2 consoles simultaneously, and I never really got to play all the games on the systems. It was just kind of a very pointless thing, really, to be honest. So yeah, I basically bought the GameCube and the Xbox pretty much at the same time. Even though they're not released at the exact time, I happened to buy them at the same time, and it never really meant that I got the most out of the GameCube or the Xbox One, really. And I also believe I did it for another system, but that was back in the day, so I don't even want to try and remember what that one was. So generally speaking, most people are only going to plump for one, either for cash reasons or just simply because they just refuse to buy 2 new consoles. So definitely speaking, the price point is going to be very interesting. Microsoft are definitely going to have to justify that. I'm not saying they cannot justify it. I'm saying that there has to be good reasons. It can't just be that, you know, we play games and we stream movies to your living room, because I will just, you know, say, that's nice, the Wii can do that. You know what I'm saying? If for a web browser, it's not that much of a big deal. It has to be for a tangible reason. And I'm not saying they can't do it. I'm just saying that they definitely do need purpose behind it. Now I'm going to very quickly tie this up by talking about the backwards compatibility, because I know some people are going to make this a very big deal indeed. Why? Why can't it run it? It's exactly the same reason I said for the PS4. It's very simple. To emulate a game system as powerful as Xbox 360, you need a very powerful CPU. To give you an idea, there hasn't been really successful emulation of on it, even on a PC. I don't know what it's me in English today. I seem to lack the ability to speak it. I'm going to blame a ridiculously long work day, don't you know? Anyway, as I was saying, the problem with emulation is it's very CPU dependent. It also is dependent upon architecture as well. And it could simply be that it would be an absolute pain in the butt to get it working, depending upon the CPU architecture and so on. And to be honest, even if it was, it could be a simple case of the fact that the Durango just won't have the CPU ability to emulate something like the Xbox 360. If you don't believe me of how intensive some of this, you know, power can be, take a look at the specifications of something like a GameCube emulator. A GameCube emulator takes a lot of CPU power indeed, but it's a GameCube. I mean, look how old the GameCube is. It's, you know, PS2 era. Even a PS2 requires quite a bit of power as well to emulate. I'm not saying, you know, it requires the latest technology available, but considering how powerful those CPUs are, you know, you look at the PS2, it's got 32 megabytes of RAM. 32! You know, that's absolutely pathetic. We've got, you know, caches on CPUs now that's got that kind of amount of memory, but it still requires quite a lot of actual CPU power to run it. And it's definitely not going to really change. The Xbox One definitely requires a lot. In fact, I don't really know about the state of Xbox One emulators. I don't really do the whole emulator thing, if I'm honest. But I certainly know that they do require quite a lot of juice behind them. So it's possible that Microsoft are going to say, hey, we know that people are going to be upset. Some people may want to just buy an Xbox 360. On the other hand, it may mean nothing towards emulation. There have been comments made by this chap, Paul Thurrott, who seems to believe that it's not going to be backwards compatible. But honestly speaking, it may simply be that they just want to produce a very low price system for the market to say, hey, we're just going to clean up, because it's all gravy if people buy this for the next year or whatever. It's just gravy, it's just extra cash, it just allows us to keep pushing forward. And I honestly doubt, if they've got any sense in the world, they're just going to abandon the Xbox 360 when the Xbox 720 is released. The same as Sony are not going to do so for the Xbox, so for the PS3. It just doesn't make sense. Why? Because you've got millions upon millions of established customers who will keep buying your game that you put out on that system. Okay, you're obviously not going to make the previous generation the primary focus, because it doesn't mean, you know, it doesn't make any sense at all. But it doesn't make sense to actually cut support to it either, because when you do that, you're basically pissing off previous customers And that's just not good, because eventually they will most likely upgrade to the new system. But if you just piss them off by saying, actually, you know what, new system's out, you need to upgrade, so screw you. No one's going to do that. And to be fair to Microsoft, they actually supported the Xbox One for quite a while afterwards. Xbox Live was, well, live, if you pardon the pun, for quite a while after the original after the Xbox 360 was launched. And Microsoft, even on OS functionality, because of how popular, say, Windows 98 was, and XP indeed, they kept extending the support for quite a while. Indeed, if you guys are familiar with server range products, you'll know that support for Windows 2003 is only just ending. 2003, and that was released, well, 10 years ago or so. So they're actually pretty merciful when it comes to legacy support. They do want you to buy the latest product because obviously it benefits them, but they don't just cut you off, because that also doesn't make sense either. So there's a good chance that they do want people to, purchase this so-called Stingray system as well. Anyway, this has been an absolute massive analysis slash thoughts and opinions. I'm curious to what you guys are going to make of this news, and definitely leave your comments below. I am extremely happy right now, as RGT has literally just hit over 2,002 subscribers. Yes, I know, if you guys been with me for a while, you know that it's really seemed to have picked up recently. I will be making an official blog video on this probably tomorrow. I want to make sure that the number doesn't drop suddenly. I probably will be giving away something at some point, actually, very soon, as I have a few things that were given to me on the GPU side of things in terms of games and vouchers and stuff, and I have no use for them, so I'll probably give those away as kind of a mini celebration, if you will. So yeah, anyway, hopefully you guys have enjoyed the video. I am going to really get going now. I have absolute massive undertaking in terms of graphics editing to do. I've got to do a massive graphics comparison at some point tonight, and they take a very long time to do, I'm afraid, you guys. Yeah, I would like some condolences, if you don't mind, on that one. Anyway, thanks for watching, take care, and bye for now.